and welcome. My name's Tao Fan and I'm a research fellow in the centre based in the Monash node and the Emerging Technologies Research Lab there. It's my great pleasure to be chairing this afternoon's session on talking about automation. Once again, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting here on the stolen lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and to acknowledge elders past and present and to say that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this session is centred around three questions. What stories do we tell about automation? Whose voices and interests do they serve and whose are not? And what does it take to change the narrative? As many of us are keenly aware, automation is a topic surrounded by hype. For journalists, academics, and others tasked with reporting on issues about AI and automation, it can be difficult to disentangle the actual versus perceived capabilities of AI systems, their potential to disrupt versus their capacity to maintain power dynamics, and the real versus imagined threats and challenges. In the media landscape, the line between fact and fiction can be unclear, as familiar cultural narratives are used to help us make sense of what is often complex and hard to grasp changes across techno-economic political systems. In some cases, this line is intentionally blurred by actors who stand to profit from the muddling of truth. Indeed, the term AI is now used so liberally by big business that it has been branded by the US Fair Trade Commission as more of a marketing term than a meaningful descriptor of technical systems. In February of this year, they issued a warning to tech companies in particular to keep in check any false or unsubstantiated claims about AI when advertising their products. They outlined 4 questions in particular that tech companies should be keeping in mind. 1, are you exaggerating what your AI product can do, or even claiming it can do something beyond the current capability of any AI or automated technology? And here they focused on the ability of claims to be substantiated by evidence and strategic misuse of scientific studies to make inflated claims about, say, the ability of facial recognition tools to determine emotion, or a smart speaker to analyse and diagnose the nature of a cough. 2, are you promising that your AI product does something better than a non-AI product? Again, the focus here is on the role of evidence, and specifically what benchmarks, what criteria, what evidence is there to support a claim like this technology is X% more efficient than a person, or this technology can save X number of dollars on labour costs? 3, are you aware of the risks? Here the focus is on risks like bias, underscoring that a black box is no excuse for not accounting for these kinds of foreseeable risks, placing the responsibility of outcomes squarely back in the hands of those who market, sell, and profit from a product. 4, does the product actually use AI at all? And here they were their most direct. They state, if you think you can get away with baseless claims that your product is AI enabled, think again. In an investigation, FTC technologists and others can look under the hood and analyse other materials to see if what's inside matches up with your claims. Before labelling your product as AI-powered, note also that merely using an AI tool in the development process is not the same as a product having AI in it. And they ended with a foreboding warning that you don't need a machine to predict what the FTC might do when these claims are not supported. But it's not just PR and marketing types who are prone to exaggeration. Journalists, writers, and other members of the media can also inadvertently reproduce false claims and hype. In my own research with a team based here in the ADM+S, we've been looking at the reporting of the US firm Amazon's entry into the Australian market. Now, Amazon is infamous as a ruthless employer. For years, Australian readers have been exposed to a seemingly endless stream of stories and investigative pieces describing in gratuitous detail the backbreaking conditions across its international facilities. The effects of the infamous Amazon pace on the mental and physical health of workers. The operating model that systematises high turnovers, low wages, and precarious hiring arrangements. The daily rituals of chanting and affirmations that cultivate a deranged cultures of toxic productivity. And the targeting of low-income and racialised neighbourhoods with fulfilment centres, creating air pollution, noise pollution, congested streets, and unusable roads for pedestrians and cyclists. So given this reputation, we wanted to assess how the issue of labour was playing out here. Our research was primarily focused on conducting interviews with warehouse workers on their experiences of work within organisations, like Amazon. And we also wanted to see what trends, what issues, how labour was being characterised and reported in the public sphere. We searched for articles published in Australian news sources from their initial launch here in November 2017, so the date of our research began in November 2021. We analysed 125 articles in total and found that a third of all news items characterised the opening of Amazon warehouses as a benefit to the economy, most citing the hundreds of jobs that would be created in construction of warehouses once the warehouses were operational. But only 10%, or 14 articles in total, discussed the quality and security of these jobs. One of Amazon's warehouses in Melbourne, for instance, employed 100% of its workforce using third-party labour hire, a mechanism that, in the words of Tim Kennedy, National Secretary of what was then called the National Union of Workers, allows Amazon to have no legal obligation to workers in regards to unfair dismissal or any sense of job security. We noticed very clear PR phrases and media releases endlessly circulate. Phrases like, the new robotics warehouse is the size of 24 rugby league fields, 2 Bondi beaches, the same land size as Taronga Zoo, that it has 13,500 tonnes of locally made steel. That's 3,000 tonnes more steel than we use for the Sydney Olympic Stadium. More than 200,000 nuts and bolts, and uses about 14 kilometres of conveying equipment. And my favourite, this verbatim phrase that was repeatedly used, that the warehouse has acres of finely polished concrete, so accurately graded that any hill or depression is imperceptible to the human eye. Phrases that wrap the corporation inside of a language of the industrial sublime, a sign of Australia's great progress in modernity. And strangely enough, over a third of the articles talked about Christmas. And this was framed in different ways, with warehouses promising to open just in time for Christmas. Again, this language posits a kind of consumerist moral dimension, where Amazon is Santa Claus, who promises to get all those presents delivered just in time, which of course cuss actors like unions as the Grinch for organising those pesky strikes and picket lines and demands for things like better pay and working conditions. But misleading claims aside, talking about and telling stories about AI can genuinely be hard. This is because good stories require a certain amount of literacy. In this case, not just a grasp of technical terms and processes, but an awareness of the cultural assumptions, political forces, and historical legacies that shape the encounters we have with technology. It also requires capacities that are equal parts critical in order to pierce through the relentless amounts of hype and creative in order to craft and imagine alternative narratives. And above all else, it requires conditions of labour that enable the people who do this work to have enough space and security to exercise each of those skills. And today we're lucky to be joined by 3 brilliant speakers who model these skills in full. They come from a range of backgrounds, from policy to journalism to documentary filmmaking, and will be sharing their experience and expertise on how we can communicate technological change, create stories, and in other ways craft narratives about AI and automation that matter. And they'll each be addressing these 3 questions. So in this session, I'm going to be inviting each of our panelists to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes each on their experiences of talking about automation. We'll then have some time at the end for a collective Q&A discussion with the audience. So use your Slido thingy, and I'll read your questions aloud and do my best to get to each of them. Yes. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker. So our first speaker is Michael Lucy, Deputy Science and Technology Editor at The Conversation. Michael is an award-winning journalist and science writer, and since 2019 he's been Deputy Editor for Science and Technology at The Conversation and was previously an editor at The Monthly and Cosmos magazine. He also worked in communications for the Tongan Ministry of Agriculture and the Melbourne-based agency Science in Public. Please join me in welcoming Michael.
Thanks, Tal, and thanks for having me here today. I work on science and technology stories at The Conversation, and automation in various guises comes up a lot, particularly over the past year or so with launch of the current wave of consumer products that use generative AI. And I want to talk about how to tell good stories about automation. And by that, I mean stories that help people understand how automated systems really work, I suppose. And I should say up front that I don't have all the answers. And I'm a journalist, so I apologize in advance if all this seems quite basic. And I'm going to try to outline some of the reasons I think telling stories about automation can be difficult, and then just look at a few examples of good and bad ones. And by the end of this, hopefully we'll be less confused, or confused at a higher level, at least. I think basically there are sort of two reasons, or two kinds of difficulty in talking about automation. There's sort of the inherent difficulties of the topic. So automated systems are complicated. We don't have good intuitions or metaphors for understanding them. And we're often talking about sort of things that are sort of widely distributed in space, maybe globally distributed, involving large numbers of people, lots of small subsystems, each of which is, technically complicated in their own right. It takes just huge amounts of social and technical complexity to make something like, Uber Eats or ChatGPT work. And we usually only encounter small parts of these systems, I suppose, right? And the parts we encounter are designed to obscure their inner workings, to sort of minimize friction for consumers. Okay, so that's the first set of difficulties. And the second is, this is sort of what Tao was talking about, is that we might say that the information space in this area is very cluttered and contested, and there are, the narratives we have about, that we often see in the media about why automation is good and inevitable, and how a lot of these products will help our lives, are coming from companies and people with a lot of money and power and a vested interest in seeing these projects succeed. And we also get a lot of narratives about AI in particular, and some of which are quite loopy, that we'll come to as well, from these same people. So I think trying to look past these ideas and disentangle them is a worthwhile endeavour. So in a journalist terms, in journalism you tend to talk about how a good story should address 5 questions, which is who, what, where, when, and why. And with automation and AI, we often encounter a 6th W, which is just, what the fuck are these people talking about? And so there's, just to give you one example that I came across the other day, I was looking up, there's a guy called Holden Karnowski who runs the Open Philanthropy Foundation, which gives away money from Dustin Moskovitz, who is one of the Facebook founders, right? And I came across this post he had made on an effective altruism forum where he's talking about, he sort of starts off talking sensibly about AI safety, blah, blah, blah. And before you know it, he's saying, this is important because whatever comes after the current stage of civilization will most likely form a galactic civilization that will last for 1 billion years. And this is all completely deadpan, and you sort of just, what are we talking about? How do you get to these places? Anyway, so a lot of strange ideas floating around, and you sort of have to sort through them. So now all these 5 or 6 questions are difficult to answer in ways that are clear and accurate. So you have to figure out who your story should focus on if you're trying to tell a story about automation. What are you talking about in technical terms? What's the system? How does it work? Where is any of this happening, if there is some physical location? When's it happening, and of course why? And then the WTF questions lead you to sort of meta questions about who is promoting various answers to all the other questions, and why they're doing that. So I guess my rule of thumb for telling stories about automation is try to get answers to these questions that are as concrete as possible. Find real people, real places, real events. Don't shy away from complexity, and to keep a critical eye open about where information and opinions and narratives are coming from. So now I'll just look at a few examples of bad and good reporting on automation. Now, if I can, hang on. So I think, yes, all right. There's just a few headlines here, and I'm not going to go through each of these stories in detail, but you can see where we're having conversations with chatbots, press conferences with robots. We're making big claims about the future. We're trusting the bots. Some of these are pretty reputable news outlets. I mean, there's also like The Sun there, but this kind of language and approaches are very common. So we can see some common failings, I think, which is a tendency to anthropomorphize AI systems, which is hard to avoid. We see faces in clouds. You grow attached to pet rocks. It's not surprising that we will tend to anthropomorphize anything we can. And chatbots in particular are specifically designed to be deceptive and imitate human behaviour. So the stories are also sort of treating sort of hype and corporate framing as fact. Plans and proposals are treated as things that will be happening. And there's not a lot of pushback here, and this sort of ties in with treating the future, the sort of projected future, as inevitable, and as if there is no alternative to the current proposals. And overall, there's sort of not a lot of you feel that is motivated by sort of a lack of technical understanding in a lot of cases and lack of perspective. So a few better examples here. Again, you see here we're starting to talk about real people, people who work in the production of automated systems, people whose industries are being affected by automation, people whose whole jobs are a kind of tug of war with the algorithms that distribute tasks and set their pay. We also have some reporting showing where automation will impact readers, in their lives at supermarket checkouts or what have you, highlighting criticisms, and also a story about how this narrative of AI apocalypse is being promoted in US colleges. And what I think is good about these is they're sort of trying to open the black box and show how automated systems work, and they're mainly about concrete events and people rather than abstract ideas, the future and so on. They highlight critical voices instead of just accepting corporate framing, and they're interested in questions about money and power and who benefits from automated systems and who does not benefit and why. So look, I think I'm going to leave it there so we have time to move on. I don't have a great conclusion, but hopefully if you have ideas, hit me up. We can all move on.
Thank you so much, Michael. I would also like the lack of perspective, I think, is really great. And I would really love to sort of raise the question of things like the economy with which these stories circulate as well, in particular sort of the platformization and this click economy of news and what this does to content specifically. If we could bring that up, that would be great. Or if anybody would like to ask it on the Slido, if you just use your QR code, we're in LT106. Okay, our next speaker is Lauren Kelly from RMIT. Lauren Kelly is a PhD candidate with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. Her research considers how human labour is augmented by technologies in supermarket warehouses and distribution networks, and what this means for autonomy and organised labour. Lauren has professional experience in the union movement as a researcher and policy advisor. Please join me in welcoming Lauren.
Thank you. Thanks, Tao. Hi, everyone. So today I'd like to offer reflections from two different positions that I hold. The first is as a media coordinator for a big union, the United Workers Union, that covers a range of different frontline and essential industries. And then the second position, as you may have guessed, is as a PhD candidate here with the ADM+S Centre. And I think in large part my work as a media coordinator has really come to inform how I go about my research in my PhD, how I try to interview workers that I speak with, and then broadly, I suppose, just how I am trying to tell stories about technology and labour. So in my role as a union media coordinator, I field a lot of calls from journalists looking to write stories about automation and its effects on workers. Usually they want quite a simplistic case study and a hero shot of a worker who has been affected. And then especially off the back of the pandemic, there's a real increasing appetite for stories about algorithmic management and workplace surveillance as well, especially in working from home settings. But as sort of Tao and Michael have already alluded to, telling stories about automation and how it impacts on workers is a really deceptively difficult task. So automation as a general term can mean a lot of different things, especially in the workplace setting. It's often used as a bit of a catch-all for kind of various processes like mechanization, robotics, digital platforms, AI, and so many more. And I think the specific functions of the technology require this specialist knowledge to understand how they really work and are often misunderstood, or they're kind of hard to get at. And then even more so, the workplace context in which the technology is embedded, the labour process, unique organisational forces, and even like historical struggles over how that technology has been implemented and used in a particular site, a particular time and place. These are really complex, different dimensions, and they really require quite a level of industrial literacy that often journalists, not just journalists, but I think the public at large just doesn't have. So this really greatly complicates what can seem like a straightforward media request for a story about automation. And with some notable exceptions, of course, I find that too often stories about automation and workers can reproduce very simplistic tropes and sometimes even classist assumptions about the value of particular jobs. We see stereotypes about the blue-collar worker destined to become obsolete. This recurs again and again. Often I find the kind of prevailing narrative here is that there's this humanoid robot that's ready to step in and take their place, that's, you know, unrelenting in pace, doesn't need sick days, etc., etc. But I find here it can be quite offensive when sometimes it's implied that the labour process is already so machine-like and repetitive that that worker was kind of already acting like a robot anyway, and that the humanity is really stripped away in the story. And I think these stories, they reduce workers rather to these sort of one-dimensional caricatures, and they are often sort of devoid of agency or power to change the situation as well. There's always this kind of deterministic inevitability narrative at hand. And then tropes of the white-collar worker, they sort of take on a different tone, but I think they can be just as detrimental. So here you've got the sort of professional managerial worker, or perhaps the creative worker. And I think in these stories, they're experiencing this destabilisation of hard-earned, well-deserved job security. So perhaps they obtained their role through higher education. There's this sort of injustice that comes with the idea that the role could be stripped away or changed in some way. And here I think the sentiment is one of loss and one of anxiety rather than of inevitability, as is the case with the blue-collar worker. And I think these sentiments, of course, are perfectly valid, but I do think sometimes they can reflect the class position and anxieties of the people telling these stories. There's sort of this idea of, okay, when it happened to the warehouse worker, it was sort of affecting someone else, but now it could come for these white-collar, real professional jobs that we worked really hard for to have, you know. It's like, I think we've all sort of seen these stories getting around. And I think, again, the sentiment is valid and I understand where it comes from. But I do think, particularly now, either rightly or wrongly, a lot of writing and media professionals, so people who hold a kind of privileged position to tell these stories, are feeling quite defensive at the moment, particularly in the wake of certain technologies like ChatGPT, etc. And I think there's a really seductive quality to these tropes. They're easy to grasp, the story can be gleaned just from the headline, and they tend to travel well and are shared very widely, so there's this sort of economy at play as well, and it does incentivise these kinds of stories. Journalists and academics alike are measured by things like engagement and reach, so there are kind of perverse incentives at play to reproduce these tropes and stories. But of course we do ourselves a real disservice when, you know, we do sort of take shortcuts and tell these really simple stories. So in my own PhD research, I found that empirical case studies of automation and algorithmic management are often very complex. Often the picture they paint is sort of less spectacular or jazzy at first blush, but it's always more enduring and interesting, I find. So take, for example, warehouse automation. So in recent years, both Coles and Woolworths have announced the closures of more traditional warehouses and they're moving to more automated sites. and these are currently being designed, constructed and rolled out as they become operational. And it's certainly the case that over time, less workers are required to kind of achieve the same level of productivity at these newer facilities compared to the older ones. But this is really just one small part of the story. So even the most sophisticated warehouses, of course, require human workers to function, and staff levels are often much higher than originally projected or that are pitched to shareholders. And what's more, employment in warehousing in Australia is steadily increasing. There's many more warehousing jobs available in Australia today than there were 5 years ago. But what is changing is the composition of labour and the kind of employment that's on offer. So when one unionised site closes and unionised workers take redundancy packages, for example, they're often too young to retire. They continue to do warehousing work, but they move into new roles with other companies, often through labour hire arrangements for less pay and on worse conditions. And in fact, some companies actually trade on this. They regularly close warehouses and open new sites under these greenfield agreements, which essentially removes all union wages and conditions that were typically fought for over years at the previous site, and it moves the bargaining round back to square one. And new sites are often opened on the other side of town to dissuade redundant workers from making the commute. And they have this new site that opens devoid of union culture, wages and conditions. So in a way, sometimes, actually, the strategy of automation is actually a very effective deunionisation strategy as well. And this happens again and again and again, but I find it sort of rarely makes it into the headlines about stories about warehousing and automation. And in the case of algorithmic management too and surveillance, my research also paints a bit of a more complex story. So my interviews with supermarket personal shoppers, for example, has revealed that digital devices, they do deliver quite overt instructions for how the work is to be carried out and how long it should take. But in the context of a particular workplace culture, there's also quite significant room for personal discretion as well. So workers speak fondly of the kind of human touch required to intuit and handle a family's weekly shop, and often describe a great deal of pride and care taking in packing perishable items like fruit and vegetables, for example. But then, of course, at the same time, the use of these digital devices in the picking and packing of items, it has ushered in more direct forms of work monitoring and speed up and KPIs, and the de-skilling of longer-serving workers who once relied on their experience, memory and product knowledge to do the role. So I think in the case of personal shoppers in the supermarkets, automation technologies are really augmenting the labour process and their experience of work rather than replacing it. And I've also found that workers will often use technologies in ways that were not originally intended. So one such example is the practice of work games in the supermarket setting, in which workers gamify their own labour and race each other and the clock in response to KPIs. And workers can also resist and even sabotage certain automation technologies to either cause harm to the employer directly or just slow down the pace of work. Such acts are often quite interesting to hear about. They range from the sort of relatively benign, like leaving the scanner gun off the charge overnight so that when you come in the morning, it takes 15 to 20 minutes to charge up, so I'll just have another quick coffee before I can get onto my shift. I think that's brilliant, personally. To more sort of drastic measures of physically jamming up the conveyor belts. And Tao talked about how much, these kilometres of conveyor belts in some of these very automated sites are very technologically impressive, but it does also route products through one particular line and does actually leave them quite susceptible to being physically jammed up as well. And I think this very critical approach to technology can reveal how technology is not inevitable or predetermined, but a very contested process suspended between different possibilities. And the question of power is particularly pronounced in the workplace setting because firms are not and make no claim to be democratic environments. They are, in effect, a form of private government, and most often automation technologies are introduced without any consultation with workers. And I think the same can be said of many surveillance technologies, which, when embedded within a particular managerial regime, influence and shape how work is carried out. Media stories will often seize upon bossware tech, technologies like keystroke monitoring and things like that, I think because it offers a very clear-cut example of workplace surveillance. But there are other forms of surveillance I see in my work all the time that I think also merit discussion. So what about the HR person sitting purposefully in the staff lunchroom when the union rep visits, just innocently eating their lunch? What about on-site group dormitory accommodation in the case of seasonal farm workers, when you have workers all sharing the same roof where they live and sleep and eat with their supervisor? And what about automated text messages that advise of shift notifications from labour hire companies? So I think these sort of less technologically sophisticated forms of surveillance and automation can reveal very interesting stories as well. And just to start summing up, in my own research, I try to capture this complexity, highlighting in particular the organisational factors and human struggle over the future of automation and work. There's a lot of different ways I do this, and I've certainly learnt a lot from everyone else on the panel here today as well. One way I try to do it is sticking close to workers and telling the stories that I hear firsthand. Sometimes these stories are not immediately captivating or sensational, but I find once you dig deeper and that organisational context is revealed, something really important and enduring always emerges. And it sounds cliche, but there's a certain amount of trust and curiosity that's required to tell the stories of other people in a respectful and meaningful way. People can really sense when there's a genuine interest in their work and what it means for them, and they can also tell when an academic or a journalist already has a predetermined story in mind and now just wants a punchy quote to fill in after the fact. In my experience with the union and also as a researcher now, I find people really like to talk about their work, especially work that doesn't receive a lot of attention or isn't seen as being particularly kind of cutting edge or spectacular, and they always have these incredible and often very surprising insights as well. But workers do want to have conversations about their work on their own terms and highlight the things that matter most to them. Sometimes automation figures high on that list, but often it doesn't. And we have to sort of be respectful of that as well. So yeah, I try to approach my research with an open mind, with, like a loose set of questions, but I'm always open to being guided to a story that's perhaps not the one that I originally set out to tell. Anyways, I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to discussing further. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lauren. And again, I love what you said there about the perverse incentives. So the perverse incentives that play in sort of our own academic economies. Maybe that's something also to add the influence of the impact agenda on how we tell stories. So our final speaker is Jenny Lee, who is a research fellow in the ADM+S. So Jenny Lee is the resident documentary filmmaker and has 2 decades experience collaborating with diverse community groups, organisations, activists, artists and academics to produce character-focused documentary films promoting diversity, gender diversity and social justice. Jenny's films have been selected for a range of film festivals, including the Adelaide Film Festival, Sheffield Doc Fest, and South by Southwest Austin, and broadcast on ABC and SBS. Please join me in welcoming Jenny.
Thanks, Dow, and thanks, Lauren and Michael. I'm really happy to be here sharing my perspective today on the stories we tell about automation and why they matter. Before I launch into a few examples, I just wanted to start with this little exercise. Can you please wave your hand in the air if you're from Silicon Valley? No, okay. You wave your hand in the air if you identify as tech bro? No, no one, okay. Majority of what we hear, most of the stories we hear about AI and its impacts are fed to us by the corporate sector and Silicon Valley tech bros. From blatant PR to manufactured fear. These are the silicon-coded utopian and dystopian views designed to sell products. And they mostly don't represent what a lot of us in the room think and feel. But there's a world of alternatives out there. The work that I do at the centre looks at the social impacts of what we know as AI on the rest of the people. People living outside of Western countries, people fighting for a cause outside of capitalism, differently abled people, women. So as a documentary filmmaker, my approach over the last 20 years has been rooted in participatory methods, creating collaborative and people-centred films. So ethics, respect, empathy and sensitivity are at the core of this work, and following communication for social change principles. So I focus on making films with people as opposed to making films about people. And then the idea is always to use the outputs for research, education and advocacy purposes. So my documentaries most often focus on everyday people. So ensuring the dignity of the participants is non-negotiable. So to give a little bit of history, my first film followed Australian circus performers working with street kids in Cambodia, building their confidence and perhaps surprisingly raising their social status. Some of my other early films include Casualties of War, which explores post-traumatic stress in soldiers through one person's lived experience, an animated storytelling initiative with young mums, a project with girls abducted by the rebel forces in Sierra Leone, and more recently I assisted girls to make their own films challenging child marriage in West Bengal. So common themes in my work are gender-based violence and environmental concerns, which to me are connected. So as an ADM+S resident filmmaker, I'm drawn to explore the ways that everyday people use, modify and appropriate or even resist new technologies. So I'd like to share a clip with you all now. This is a compilation of short grabs taken from a short film series that I made together with my team here called Flight Paths, Freeways and Railroads. So this project documents the everyday realities and future visions of deaf and blind individuals as they commute around the city.
Travel in the future. So I'd love to have a case. Oh, and it just goes bigger. So I basically click a button, it's the size of a case, and it becomes my car. So it's as small as a case, then it becomes a car. So when I could go shopping, I could decrease it in size, toss it up, put it in my pocket. Even better. Don't need to worry about parking, nothing like that. Yeah, don't need to worry about it.
Crossing roads is one of my least favourite things to do. Especially with electric vehicles, I can't hear them coming. I think what makes me nervous about the idea of, these self-driving cars coming out, I've always drawn confidence from knowing that 99% of the time drivers are looking where they're going and they would see me coming. And it makes me nervous that this technology will not be able to do that with the same care as a living, breathing person.
I definitely would not like to use an automatic car because it's risky, but I wouldn't mind using smartphones.
If you are having trouble following the route, press the Get Directions button.
That's the app Clue. Someone wouldn't necessarily need to call an orientation mobility specialist. They might be able to open that app, and that app could give you some of that basic information.
I don't think it will fully replace your job.
No.
I often use my phone at least to kind of check my general location, or even just simple sometimes as being like, Siri, where am I? To make sure I'm on the right track. It kind of is my eyes, I suppose.
Like, I'd love a new car, to be honest with you. That would be great, But the one problem is in regards to deafness. In regards to brakes as well, like the brake pads, for example, hearing people can hear it, they know.
I mostly tend to commute with a family member, but with the Western cultures, they just put too much emphasis on being independent, and now they are trying to use technology for that. Like, they're just trying to minimize dependency on other humans. Like, you need to be dependent on other humans. I'm definitely looking forward to technological innovation. I do appreciate it, and I think we should make the most of it, but when we are relying on technology, we should not isolate ourselves and to reduce the human participation in our lives.
I could never imagine Ellie being replaced with an automated system. I'm sure a robot or something could beep at me or tell me when I'm at a particular traffic light or what street I'm at, but I don't think it could guarantee the same accuracy. My guide dog will never run out of batteries. She'll never run out of phone reception. And I'm able to teach her things and communicate with her in a way that I could never with a piece of technology.
So reflecting on Dow's questions, what stories do we tell about automation and whose interests do they serve? Making these films, you just saw some grabs from, involves spending time with people who are in traditionally marginalised groups, listening and having genuine two-way dialogue about their lived experience of the impacts of AI, and then amplifying their perspective and sharing it with different stakeholders. So their stories could be heard by decision makers and designers and of course the general public. Participatory film projects aim to empower the participants, allowing them to recognise their own strengths. In creating films of this nature, filmmakers face the challenge of maintaining relationships, avoiding sensationalism, and staying true to participants, audiences, and their own creative vision. So for the Flight Path project, before I filmed, I engaged in conversations with Michaela, Brenton and Orhan. I provided them with a film prompt to get them thinking about automation now and into the future. And then each participant designed their own commute that they wanted me to film, conducted a short interview, and then we had 3 stages of feedback: rough cut, fine cut, lock off, where I would take on board their changes that they wanted made and reflected in the films. So throughout, the films have been broadcast on SBS and have received positive responses from Volkswagen in Germany and Volvo in Sweden, and you can now view them on SBS On Demand if you're interested to see the full 5-minute versions. So the project I'm currently working on, AI Rewired, amplifies the voices of women using AI for climate justice, women who live on the front lines of climate change and where the social impacts of AI are being felt firsthand right now. Keep going the wrong way, don't I? This is Aditri. She lives in the Sundarbans, which is a renowned climate hotspot. Following a major cyclone, she was trafficked for sex. When she was rescued, she was stigmatised in her own community. She's now a leader of a survivors group in West Bengal, where she lives. In September this year, she's trialling an app called Roba Mitra and sharing it with her peers. The app includes an AI-powered chatbot that aims to help her build resilience to climate shocks and to being re-trafficked, as well as providing sexual health support. The chatbot will be trained for 6 months in the Sundarbans before it's rolled out there. In his book, Resisting AI, Dan McQuillan asks, where are the technologies that people really need? We need to reclaim the idea of socially useful production, of technological developments that start from community needs. Instead of being complicit with expensive toys running in carbon-emitting data centres, we can focus instead on centering activities of care, a positive search for alternatives. So we know that many corporate future visions do not represent what everyday people think and feel. Some of these corporate visions really pave the way for greater ease for a very small demographic of people who, to be honest, have it pretty easy already. But there are alternatives. So I use documentary as research practice. So I use a camera and a microphone to describe things that people do and events, and then use the editing process as an analytical tool. So filming people in their everyday lives can inspire our thinking and help us come up with new ideas. I aim to listen to, amplify and learn from alternative worldviews and focus on stories of hope. It's not an easy approach, and this method would not suit probably the vast majority of research. It's time consuming, it can be very expensive, and at times it's physically and emotionally exhausting. To give a few practical guidelines, however, I intentionally seek out subjects I know will translate to film and communicate with a general audience that's not AI savvy. I bring different consultants on board each project to help me. I need to consider ethics at every stage of the process, so protecting vulnerable participants needs to be my primary obligation, and checking in with how people feel about being involved at every stage of the process, as well as being mindful of what happens after I leave. So this is much easier to facilitate if I collaborate with a partner on the ground or a champion who already has established relationships with the community. So in conclusion, if underrepresented groups and people traditionally on the margins have an opportunity to express their ideal visions and their apprehensions for the future, then they can claim a stake in that future. Thank you.
So I'm now going to invite all our speakers just up to the front for our Q&A session. Again, you can submit your questions on the Slido. We're in LT 106. We've got a question or two there already, but I'm going to start us off. I might start us off actually just with the few comments that we picked up after your talk, Michael, and after your talk, Lauren, about sort of the economy with which these stories circulate. In one instance, we were talking a little bit about the platform economy with which the stories circulate and the kind of perverse incentives there are there to generate clicks, for example, and how hype is in many ways rewarded. And indeed, even we as academics, if we hate the story, we still need to click on it in order to read it. And within that economy, a click is always a positive signal. And the same sort of perverse incentives that exist for academics, for example, when we're invited to increase our impact agenda. I wonder if any of you wanted to speak to those points.
Yeah, okay. All right. So, yes, yeah, you're quite right. Media, certainly, and to an extent, academia, there's incentives around getting attention. And big claims get attention and are more likely to be shared and so on and so forth. And that, there's no sort of easy way to fix that I'm aware of. You need to get people's attention, otherwise there's not really much point. So I guess you just, the way I think about it in my own work is just trying to stay honest and think about trying to find a line where you can say something that is sort of catchy and shareable and repeatable, but is also true and useful. And there's, don't always succeed, but yeah. I don't know if I have any more insight than that, unfortunately.
I don't know if I have the perfect solution, but another kind of complicating factor is sometimes even if you write something that tries to get at the complexity and then maybe it generates attention for a good reason, and then you're invited to speak on it, perhaps on Talkback Radio or or with the media, then you sort of get pigeonholed very quickly, like, okay, so what are you saying? Is it good or is it bad? And then the sort of the substance of what you're trying to say can be really whittled down in a kind of disappointing way as well. But yeah, I think putting out work that you're proud of, I always try to think, try to write things that if the people like the workers I was interviewing were to read the story, would I be sort of embarrassed to see them afterwards, or would I feel proud? Would I chat to them about it or not? If you feel a bit iffy about how you've represented them or the quotes, then I don't think you've done a good job. So I think that's all you can really do is hold yourself in check, but don't have control of some of those other kinds of factors, yeah.
Do you want to jump in, Jen, as well?
I guess all I'd add to that, because I think everyone does have to have a hook into their story, and we all do it, and otherwise, yeah, not only the audience, you're also not going to get funded, unfortunately, and like researchers need funding, films need funding, so we actually have to sell our stories as well before we get them made. And so you do have a hook in, but you can still remain true to those people. And like you say, be honest and ethical. And, my practice is the 3 stages of feedback at least, and then nothing goes out until they've said that's okay and it's done, yeah.
Just on that, there's a question from the audience for you, Jenny. Are there any non-negotiables to ensuring participants' voices are amplified over industry organisations' expectations you're working for? I guess, yeah, what are your non-negotiables when you're working with your participants, and how do you keep them at the centre?
Well, because I co-create the stories with them, I guess they never go into places they're not happy to go. With, say, working with Aditri in the Sundarbans, that's been something that's been arranged through an organisation that's been working with her for a very long time on the ground. So there's a lot of ethics about talking out about that the stigmatisation is so huge in her community. And if that goes out on the local network, then that's massive. So every single step of the way, recheck in. Okay, you were happy to have that filmed when it's been edited. Now are you still happy for that to get out there? And, oh, what if we got a broadcast in Asia? Would that be okay? You've got to check every single step of the way, because she might be happy to have that shown to a public audience in Australia, but not India.
Mm.
Yeah.
I've got a question for Lauren. This is from Glenn. So personal shoppers are also working on stage, as it's surrounded by supermarket customers as well. So do personal shoppers experience this as another kind of surveillance? And there's a question that we can tag on to that as well, which is somebody asking a bit more about your methods for research. So maybe speak to the question of performativity for personal shoppers, but then also how that's observed through the methods you use in general.
Sure, it's a good question. The role of doing the personal shopping in a workplace setting where there's customers is a kind of double-edged sword. So I think especially during the pandemic, when there was really heightened levels of customer aggression towards frontline staff, that was a problem. There was also this kind of tension because it's logistical labour that would normally be out of sight of the customer, and so a lot of customers perceived it as it wasn't sort of worthy as being in the supermarket, and it was getting in their way, especially because they use these big trolleys. So some people, I guess, were sort of heightened and cranky in the supermarket already, and then they were getting frustrated with the personal shoppers doing that work out on the shop floor. Then, interestingly, the flip side is some personal shoppers have told me they like doing what is essentially warehouse work in the context of a public supermarket because it slows down the pace of work, because they can use customers as an excuse. So if they don't hit a pick rate or a KPI, they can say, oh, I had to show this sweet little old lady where the soup is, right? And they interestingly talk about being in, say, in a dark store or in a warehouse as being kind of frictionless and being exposed to the relentless frictionlessness of a space like that because there's no human customer to kind of get in the way or slow them down. So I find that quite fascinating. In terms of my methods, I do a lot of interviews with workers, and then I guess the way I kind of go about trying to get access to those people is through connections with various unions. And the way that I open up the conversations in the interviews is very conversational, and I always kind of check in along the way and say, you know, is there something I'm missing here, or do you think that's the right question to be asking? And I've actually changed a lot of my interview structure through feedback and in conversation with people. And I usually, if the interview goes for about an hour, I usually get it around the halfway point. And I actually still have more questions to go, but I'll usually throw over to them and say, so what have we sort of talked about so far that's getting at what you think's interesting, but maybe we haven't quite really gotten to the nugget of it? And then usually they'll say, you know, a couple questions back, actually, X, Y, and Z. And then they kind of get led down that path.
Brilliant. I have a question, maybe I'll direct this at Michael. So with our tendency to gravitate towards alarming or exaggerated headlines, what advice do you have for media consumers to sift through the misleading stories about AI?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say just read, but read skeptically, I suppose. I mean, you can't read everything. Be selective about your media sources, and just take everything with a grain of salt, I suppose. And you know, sometimes I'll see articles and sort of dismiss them from the headline alone, which you know is probably not best practice. But you don't have time to read everything. So just you know, be aware and you know, think about where things are coming from. Just general media literacy stuff, I suppose. Just another, you know, there are a lot of topics, I suppose, where you kind of build yourself a little mental picture about what's going on in this field, and then when something, you know, so when you see a headline, you can go, oh, that seems a bit far-fetched, or you know, it seems plausible. And I mean, often that's the best you can do, unless you're, and then when you need to investigate something more closely, then you really start reading again.
Maybe it's 2 o'clock now, but I might, because we started just a few minutes late, I might let us go maybe like 5 minutes over, if that's okay. So I've got a question for Jenny. Quite an interesting question, I think, about, how do you get feedback from diverse participants? So specifically, how do you effectively communicate the visual aspects of the work to some of the blind participants that you're working with?
Yeah, that was interesting. Michaela, who you saw some grabs from her film, she really acted as she's a blind advocate, so she acted as my consultant for that project, and she gave me a lot of advice right at the start. We had a lot of phone calls, and she talked to me about different ways of working and what worked for her, so that really helped for me when I was working with Orhan as well. So she was very generous with her time and communication, and we did audio descriptions. So for sending a prompt to Orhan and Michaela, it was actually a PowerPoint presentation, but with audio descriptions. So we still managed to work that way, and then the films, of course, we just do audio descriptions the whole way through, and subtitles for Brenton. Yeah.
Okay, there's 2 questions that I'm going to combine into one. This one is, can you use AI to sift through the what the fuck stories you were pitched about AI? Whoa! Can you use AI to help us interpret AI? That's the mind-exploding version. And the other version of it is there more human-machine compatible ways? How can we sort of be in conversation with AI as we tell stories about AI?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, like I have sort of the things I've done with ChatGPT, and we use a bit of Anthropic AI makes a chatbot called Claude that I have used a bit. Most of the stuff I've done has been, I would say, mucking around rather than serious attempts to integrate this into my workflow, because it seems to be, at this stage, not worth the effort, or maybe I don't have the time. Anyway, if you do ask them, chatbots in general to explain things to you, including AI, they will give you, well, unsurprising opinions, I suppose. Like, they don't give you, there's not a lot of critical thinking as far as has been my experience. You get, a very bland and general statements about what some people say this, some people say that. It's not very enlightening, I suppose. So, how to use them to get a better idea of how to work. Where I have had some success is getting them to sort of summarize bits of text, or suggest headlines or things like that. Where it's low stakes, you can get to suggest some ideas, and then you think about the results a lot, I guess. The results need a lot of inspection. Yeah, that's what I've got.
Yeah, I mean, it could be sort of reframing how we approach it, like our perspective, where we stand. So not thinking about it in terms of like an interlocutor, but thinking about it in terms of like a statistical barometer. So it's giving you the exact like statistical average. It's not giving you like an outlandish opinion. It's giving you the exact average, most expressed thing out. So if you're looking at it as a tool in that capacity to measure the most expressed thing out, then perhaps it's more useful than, say, giving me an informed. Those two things are different.
Dictionary of received ideas, or collection of cliches in a lot of senses. Yeah. Yes.
Every time you were to look at, you say, give me all your, what are the cliches? It'd be very good at that. Okay, brilliant. We're now at 5 past. I'm going to let everyone go for their break. So thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel.